Alright, YouTube, it's time to talk about why anarchism will fail. Of course, I'm not speaking just of Antifa here. They're kind of anarchists, but also kind of not, in a sense, because they use, like, the means of capitalism to promulgate their message anyway. It's sort of like communists on that. I've spoken of communism before, and I've written a new work, and I'll announce that later on that subject. And I've spoken of like socialism, social democracy, which is a nice way of saying socialism generally, or Marxism outright. But I don't think I've dedicated a video specifically to the topic of anarchism, which I probably should have done earlier, but I guess I'll do it now. As far as anarchism goes, you get all these little like groups that they're all anarcho something or other, like anarcho primitivism, anarcho capitalism, anarcho syndicalism, anarcho communism, anarcho anarchism, or whatever you want to term them. And they're all anarchists, more or less. Some of them, though, they aren't. They just use that title, I guess, to be edgy or cool, but really there's something totally different. Like ANCAPs, you talk to the average ANCAP, they're not arguing against the existence of a state. They're not arguing for basically a capitalistic free market society in the absence of really any state strictures beyond, local organization or anything. What they're arguing for is basically libertarianism in many cases. So libertarianism with more emphasis on the economic side and not necessarily really caring about some of the other issues, unless there's profit to be made, of course. Anarchism, though, inevitably will destabilize. It's much like communism. Communism destabilizes in the absence of a state. The pure stateless communism that communists claim is true communism. When you talk about like Stalin or Marx or something like that, when you talk about Mao's China or Pol Pot's Cambodia, they say, oh, that wasn't real communism because it wasn't stateless. Very well then, let's look at stateless communism, which is fundamentally similar, at least in most respects, to anarchism. Same problem. If you don't have a state, if there is no organizational authority whatsoever, it will devolve into mob rule. If you get a group of people together, organization being innate within humanity, it's an offshoot of our own evolution. It's much like the concept of competition or ambition. You get these innate biological qualities in man that were bred into us through evolution long, long ago. Before we even had a hand axe, we already had a competitive urge. We had ambitions. We had the concept, more or less, of being an individual biological being very early on in our development. These things are more or less self-evident if you look at the archaeological record. If you look at, for instance, Catalhoyuk, the remains there, the first significant proto-state of sorts, the proto-city, proto-city-state, rather. And you look at their sort of honeycomb network society that they constructed. Communists would interpret this as, oh, well, there were no, like, roads or anything. People sort of walked on top of or through one another's buildings, so they were sort of communalist. I argue differently. I say if you look at the fact that each of these homes had its own hearth, its own sleeping area, its own apparent ancestral relics as well that were buried literally sort of under the floors of these homes, it shows private ownership. It shows tribalism. It shows a familial structure that was of equal to or greater importance than the actual extended social network of the city itself. It's not communalism. It's also not anarchism. Organizing something of that kind required that there be some sort of means by which they were organizing it. It wasn't simply every man for himself in a competitive system, because such a thing breaks down. The fundamental central reason why anarchism can't work is man's competitive urge. Now, our urge to compete drove our evolution. It made us successful. There are problems with it, and we look at the modern society, we look at mutually assured destruction, or we look at imperialism or something. It can cause some violence. It can cause, in these larger organized systems, yeah, it can cause excess, especially if you get a very centralized system. This is the problem with all of communism's offshoots over time. But even in the pure form of anarchism or communism, in the absence completely of a state, man's natural drive is being it's when Marx says, for instance, oh, religion's the opiate of the masses, because it suppresses people. It suppresses their more natural inclinations. It gives them this false hope, and it doesn't mean anything, and it's abusive. It's abusive to these individuals because it's an organizational structure that grinds them down. makes all these fucking retarded laws and rules that people feel that they have to follow and so forth. Absolutely. The problem is that the absence of a state also suppresses an urge of mankind, which is organizational. The organizational urge is a direct takeoff of ambition and competition. It can be misused. It can become statism. It can become a totalitarian system. It's almost invariably authoritarian to some degree. We look around at the states today that exist in the world, and even the best among them are too constraining. They're too moralistic. The tax rate is too high almost everywhere in the world. Centrality is that problem. It's corporatism and or outright totalitarian rhetoric that really grinds people down today. Not mob rule, not big man proto-dictator like in the caveman days or something like that. It's too much centrality, which is the problem with all of communism's offshoots. Soviet Union, too much centrality, efficiency drops like a rock, corruption and graft take hold, and the system collapses fiscally. Mao's China, too central, bad ideas are made, famine breaks out, economy begins to grind down. What progress is made is outweighed heavily by the human misery present there. They end up having to adopt a mixed model. They actually become more prone to a free market because that centrality doesn't work. DPRK, you listen to what defectors say now in the DPRK. Centrality there was so constraining, even more than like Mao's China or anything Stalin ever did. It was so utterly barbarically constraining that they actually developed a sort of interior capitalism with a market economy just to survive and to make up for the fact that they had this famine going on, and things internally began at least very slightly to improve. The level of abuse dropped very slightly in North Korea because the state realized otherwise, we're going to get overthrown. At some point, we're all going to starve or get killed, so we'll let a little bit of capitalism in. And they still call it communism, of course. They still call it, workers' paradise. It's actually now ultimately a capitalist system, just an insular and very authoritarian one. And so, when we look at anarchism, we see the opposite. Instead of too much centrality, there's none. There's no central organizational structure beyond the voluntary. The problem is those voluntary structures progress, they evolve and become states. Now here's the answer. There is only one. The answer is to create a central order that is kept artificially small, prevented as much as possible from growing, and is severely constrained in its use. That way efficiency remains high. But the structure does exist to administer some degree of order, to prevent things like mob rule or some dictator from actually rising up. If we see in history the absence of power, a power vacuum almost always seems to spawn a power more central than what came before it. We can look at the Weimar Republic or something. You have a constraining order, and the constraining order is essentially not that different from some of the more laissez-faire models that we have today. You've got a bunch of Republicans and Social Democrats running things. They're very establishment, very centrist. We'd look back, say their policies weren't that different maybe from establishment politics today. It was strangulating things. And the answer came along in the form of fringe parties that vied for power. I think people forget that it wasn't just the Nazi movement that was gaining momentum around the time in the 1930s. The communists were too. If Germany hadn't fallen to Hitler in the Third Reich, it would have fallen to communism. It would have become a communist nation. You can take that on a moral token as you may, I suppose. But the thing is, it was the power vacuum, the strangulation of government, the inability to get things solved, to solve the economic problems and so forth, led to that fringe situation in which people were abused even more thereafter, in which there was war and pogroms and all these other horrible things. That's the problem. That's the problem with anarchism, too. A strangulated bureaucratic system approaches anarchism when it comes to its efficiency. When that breaks down, you get black markets. People, if they're constrained from the state by competing normally, because it's an innate human quality, we see this with the drug war here, they will compete and form black markets. If their ambitions are suppressed, they will do those things anyway. It simply becomes criminal behavior. You create a criminal culture. If you attempt to suppress man's desire to organize things, you're going to get an organizational structure but it's not necessarily going to be structured in such a way that it's beneficial for most people there. It's best to create a structure that works for as many people as possible, maintaining civility and stability, not at the cost of personal freedom. Anarchism is incapable of doing this. One group of anarchists over there might say we don't might say we want to structure our society in a voluntary fashion because we're just all a community. We structure it this way. Some other group nearby structures it a different way. When times are hard, those groups are going to compete anyway. And eventually they will devolve into tribalism and attack one another if things get critical enough for resources. They will attack one another for food. Anarchism can't really create the distribution network necessary on a general scale to prevent this from happening. A republic can, especially a very constrained republic. I would argue, of course, in my opinion, that the U.S. system would work if we just constrained government about 90% more. If we privatized about 90% of our government's functions, dropped the tax rate by a commensurate amount, moved, for instance, away from FEMA and back towards the civil defense, we stopped worrying about maintaining a massive overseas presence and guarded ourselves, and relegated most of that budget to maintaining a nuclear deterrent, we wouldn't have a lot of the problems that we have now. We'd probably also be more respected in the world. Other countries would compete with one another. They'd try to become juggernauts. They'd probably fail because their systems just aren't capable of maintaining it. Neither is ours, by the way. At some point, our system would collapse. If we continue down the path we're on, with more and more centrality, more and more spending, often wasteful and useless, we're going to collapse ourselves. If we're destroyed, it'll be from within. It won't be because somebody else nuked us off the face of the earth, ultimately. If they were, somebody would survive. But can we, socially speaking, can we in a cultural sense even survive the usurpation of freedom in this country because of more and more centrality that very closely now is approximating like a Chinese mixed model anyway? That's essentially the economic system that we use. As far as socially, we've never been more authoritarian, and we keep getting more authoritarian over time. It's dumb. But anarchism is worse than anything. It's worse than outrage. Even the communists have better ideas than the anarchists do. The anarchist, in their utopian delusion, believes that if the state is simply deleted, that people will leave behind their organizational tendencies. Within communism, they think that if they simply get rid of inner competition, that people will leave behind their competitive drive. These two ideologies both have the same fundamentally biological issue. It's just a different part of that biology that they're utterly violating. For instance, communism can retain that organization, although they call it impure communism if they do. But it can't really foster competition because it's seeking to homogenize, because it must seek to homogenize under its philosophical ethos. Anarchism can perhaps retain competition. Yeah, the anarchists might compete with one another, and it might have some sort of loose idea of currency or a market or something. But it would be unadministered by a state. Organization would take hold. You'd end up with a mob syndicate ruling one group of anarchists. You'd end up with a strongman, like pseudo-dictator, running another group. It would be innate. And it wouldn't even take that long. It wouldn't be that long, because anarchism is not the natural state of man. Our tendency is towards more order, towards more organization, because it's an evolutionary trait. It's part of biology. You're not going to be able to deny it. The proper role, then, of the people is to constrain that organizational tendency, to hold it back, to restrain it through the use of a constitution, through limiting the government, forcing the government in many cases, separating the powers apart to compete with one another. Now, in our system, that's no longer really functioning. We have a constitution. It's kind of ignored by the government. That's very regrettable. It should be changed. That's a problem we can theoretically solve. The separation of powers is broken down. The legislature abdicates half its responsibilities and stonewalls on the other half. The judiciary is too activist in some cases and unwilling to be activist enough in others. We've got a dysfunctional government, but it's not the problem of the existence of a state, it's how we structured that state. The Constitution doesn't constrain the government enough. We need more guarantors within the Constitution to drastically cut the amount of overall productivity the government is ever privy to, number one, to reduce the bureaucratic burden, number two, to eliminate as many moral laws as possible, number three, to prevent perpetual proxy warfare, number 4. And also, I would say, for campaign finance reform to get sort of the big money, the other corrupted organizations, out of the elections altogether, return it to a one-person, one-donation system. If we accomplish that, our system will be perfected. Long term, it will be quite stable. It will still, the tree of liberty occasionally needs a little bit of a shearing, but it wouldn't be particularly drastic. It would be much more stable than it is now. We would have a state, but it would be constrained, and its growth would be extremely slow, much more slow than it has been over the last few centuries under a similar but less constraining system that we've been using. Anarchism, though, is incapable of creating such a stricture. That group of people may decide to go completely rogue and say, oh, well, we're going to start doing things this way. Because we're in a voluntary fashion, we've all decided to do that. And what is at first billed as temporary, remember, among the corrupt, is usually permanent. Oh, give me this power temporarily. Our enemies are going to attack us. These non-anarchists over there have taken up arms. They want our land. Give me commanding power over, people with guns. We'll muster arms and fight them. They go off and fight them and win. It's like, oh, well, maybe we should maintain this force longer. This seems to work pretty well. It's pretty efficient. Why don't we have a group of people, and here's how the proto-state forms. We'll take a little bit of the productivity to supply the basic rudiment of industry to create more ammo and to maintain our arms and to, build some battlements or something. That way, next time this happens, it'll be easier to deal with. And the people will respond positively, especially in times of stress. Famine comes along. People begin to get hungry. Oh, well, we can solve this problem. Maybe we should just go take their land. They're not having a famine. Oh, maybe we need to centralize all of this material and ration it out. Otherwise, our culture will fall. But it's only temporary. Trust us. We'll never do it permanently. Once the famine is over, everything will be fine. Of course, if somebody's corrupt, they're going to make sure that it seems like the famine is ongoing forever so that they can continue to control things. It's the way humans operate. That's why you have to have a system that is constrained, but it has to exist. If you lack that centrality at all, that's what happens. You're going to get it anyway. Decentralized centrality is what you would end up with in an anarchist sort of system. People would amalgamate into groups. They would get into infighting. It's just what will happen. It's innate. It's part of our biological drive. It's the same thing that keeps communism from working. It is impossible to create your utopian anarchist or communist system. It will never happen. There will never be a day at which these systems, in the pure form spoken of by their adherents, exist for more than a very short time before they utterly implode on themselves. And that's my final word on anarchism, and a little bit of a jab at communism. I'll speak more about that later. That's about all.